You're sitting there scrolling through endless listings, wondering if splurging on a high-end DDR5 kit is really going to make a difference for you, or if you're just throwing money at a hype-driven upgrade that you'll never notice in real life. I get it, every dollar counts when you're building a PC, especially when the next big game or AI-driven workflow is just around the corner. Link is in the description if you want to check the product details on Amazon. Let's talk about the G.Skill Trident Z5 RGB 64GB kit, the 232GB modules that promise 6400MHz speed, a CAS latency of 323939102, and a 1.40V operating voltage. On paper, those numbers look like a ticket to future-proofing, but the real question is how they translate when you actually sit down to edit a 4K video, render a 3D scene, or just try to keep your system snappy while you have a dozen browser tabs open. First off, who benefits most from this kit? If you're building a workstation that will spend a lot of time in memory-heavy tasks, think large-scale simulations, professional video editing, or running multiple virtual machines, having a 64GB pool at DDR5 speeds can shave minutes off load times. The high frequency helps keep the data pipeline moving faster, and the low latency timing, CL32, means each request is answered a tad quicker than a slower, higher latency stick. For a gamer who only plays at 1080p or 1440p and isn't planning to push the envelope with massive texture packs, the extra capacity might feel like overkill. You could be fine with a 32GB kit that runs at slightly lower speeds and save a few $100s. Now, what about the practical side of installing this thing? The modules are standard 288-pin DIMMs, so any modern AM5 or LGA 1700 board that advertises DDR5 support will physically accept them. The real nuance comes with the motherboard's BIOS. Some early generation UEFI firmware can be finicky about running at the advertised 6400 MHz, requiring you to manually set the memory profile or enable an XMP 3.0 setting. If you skip that step, the kit will default down to a more conservative 5600 MHz, still fast, but not the headline spec you were chasing. In my experience, a quick BIOS update before you even start building saves you a headache later. Let's talk power. The 1.40V requirement isn't unusual for DDR5 at these speeds, but it does mean your motherboard's VRM design needs to be robust enough to keep the memory stable under load. High-performance boards with beefy power phases handle it without breaking a sweat, but a budget board with a minimal VRM could struggle, especially if you're also overclocking the CPU. I've seen cases where the system would boot fine, then crash during a stress test because the memory voltage drooped just enough to cause errors. If you're on a tight budget, double-check the VRM specs of the board you're pairing with this kit. Aesthetic considerations are part of the buying decision for many builders, and G.Skill leans into that with the Trident Z5's RGB lighting. The light bar runs the length of the module and can sync with most major motherboard RGB ecosystems, whether you're using ASUS Aura Sync, MSI Mystic Light, or Gigabyte RGB Fusion. In practice, the lighting is bright enough to be noticeable in a case with a tempered glass side panel, yet subtle enough that you can turn it off without it feeling like you've stripped away a core feature. If you're someone who cares more about silent, clean builds, the RGB may feel like an unnecessary gimmick, but it's optional and doesn't impact performance. One hidden trade-off that pops up when you compare this kit to a lower-frequency DDR5 set is latency versus bandwidth. The CL32 timing is respectable for 6400 MHz, but if you were to find a 5600 MHz kit with a CL28, you might actually get marginally better real-world responsiveness in certain latency-sensitive applications, like database queries or certain game engines that favor lower CAS numbers. For most users, the bandwidth boost from 6400 MHz outweighs the latency edge of a lower-speed kit, but it's worth noting if your workloads are very latency-centric. Another practical point is heat. The Trident Z5 includes a modest aluminum heat spreader that keeps temperatures in check under normal loads. In a high airflow case, you won't see the modules getting warm enough to affect stability. However, if you're running a densely packed build with limited airflow, the heat spreader can become a subtle bottleneck, especially when paired with a power-hungry CPU on the same memory channel. Adding a few extra case fans or ensuring your RAM isn't sandwiched behind a massive GPU can mitigate that concern. From a value perspective, the bestseller ranking tag suggests a lot of people are buying this kit, but that metric alone doesn't guarantee it's the right fit for you. The price point sits at the higher end of the DDR5 market because you're paying for both capacity and the top-tier speed. If you can comfortably afford 64GB and you have a motherboard that can actually run the advertised frequency, you're essentially paying for headroom that will keep you comfortable for the next few generations. If you're on